Good morning, I'm Brian Reagan. This is
Tyler Kelly.
And we welcome you to Mornings with Brian and Tyler. Today we continue our study of wealth and blessing in the scripture. And we go to Genesis chapter 14, verses 13 through 16. Tyler?
Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and they were allies with Abram. Now when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. So he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people.
All right. So, first of all, 318 men trained for war. What's happened here is Sodom and Gomorrah, their alliance went to war with a different alliance. They got beat. Those kings raided the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. They captured Lot and a bunch of the people, took a bunch of stuff. And someone comes to Abram. Someone who escapes comes to Abram and says, Lot's been taken along with all this other stuff. Let that part of the narrative sink in for a moment. Lot's connection to Abram was never not known by anyone. This tells me that Lot and Abram were well known together before they split apart in chapter 13. Lot and Abram also were well known and continued interaction in the region. And Lot benefited from Abram's association even after he broke out on his own. That in the event of war, and Abram goes to war, not one little shepherd guy against another shepherd guy. He goes as a shepherd against multiple kings and their cities.
And their armies.
And their armies. And their armies have already proven they can win wars. They can win. He takes 318. Let that one sink in. You say, well, brother, they were just slaves. I love how people today try and, it's America. I love America. And I say that kind of tongue in cheek. The hypocritical idiocy of America. When you want to downplay something in the Bible as being insignificant, you downplay it because of the category of the people involved. They were just slaves. But then when you get to the New Testament and you talk about recent American history, what slaves have value, and we should never. So it's an interesting thing how people change their definition to support wrong theology. Slaves are slaves. Doesn't really matter the time or the place, slaves are slaves. I don't care if you call them slaves or if you call them servants. They weren't leaving to go to someone else. They didn't have a servant contractor. You know, I've been a servant of Abraham for the last 10 years. I'd like to come over to the house of Ben-Hadad. Here's my servant contract of what I'm capable of. Could you buy me out from my master? No, they didn't do that. Okay. But let me ask you, if in America today you had to maintain housing, food, basic accommodations with that housing, health care, how much, if you kept a slave today, how much would a slave cost you? I think we could easily go a conservative number of about $30,000 a year. 30,000. So you could keep a slave cheaper than that. Well, not for how we do things in America, right? And especially not if you're a wealthy landowner. You don't want your slaves just one notch above poverty level whatever. So what's 30,000 times 300, Tyler? He loves when I make him do math. 3 million. A minimum of $3 million a year to maintain 318 slaves. Now, here's the kicker. These were not all of his slaves. These were the 318 that he had trained for warfare. So he also had the equipment to arm 318 men. So now we add that in. So if they had M4s or M16s, a few M203 grenade launchers, some saws, some M240 Gulfs, body armor, helmets, boots. Well, each one of these guys is equipped with at least $1,000 to $2,000 worth of equipment in today's standards. So there's another $350,000 to $750,000 right there in supplies. Is it starting to register? Abram had servants capable of war and all the equipment on standby for war, just in case. Poor little shepherd guy trusting in God to just barely scrape by. Oh, but God looked after him. Poor guy with not much. When Genesis 12 opens, yeah. Genesis 13 opens and what? He's very rich in men servants, maid servants, livestock, gold and silver. And then he gets bigger. And now he maintains something that costs $2 or $3 million a year minimum just to go to war, just in case. The blessing of God upon Abram, called throughout the rest of the scripture as the blessing of Abraham. Let that sink in. The blessing of Abraham. Spiritualize it all you want, that the blessing of Abraham was about Jesus. No, it wasn't. The final conclusion to the blessing of Abraham is about Jesus. Abraham, you remember what time frame we're at here, Tyler, BC wise for Abraham?
2000-ish.
Yeah, 2,000 years before Jesus. Abraham will be dead for about 1,900 years before Jesus. Mm-hmm. The blessing of Abraham was not about Jesus in Abraham's lifetime. It included it. It included everything that led up to it coming to pass in time. But in that moment, it was God giving him victory over his enemies. It was God taking care of him in business and politics. It was God taking care of him in commerce. It was God taking care of him in financial matters. It was God blessing people that were close to him so that he wouldn't be hurt by it. The blessing of Abraham. Abraham was not just some poor wandering shepherd that did okay and just, God took care of him in a new land because he had faith. No, change the language. God took care of Abram in a new land because he had faith, and it was the kind of faith and taking care of that he was very rich in men servants, maid servants, livestock, gold, silver. And these 318 men were where? Born in his house. Even if I'm generous, that means he had a husband, he had male and female couples off of which they were born, at least 50 or 60. If we say that each woman and each sired 5 or 6, he still had to have 50 or 60 more pairs of people.
Which also means they weren't much younger than he was. And it means they also did have at least some prior to going out.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, even then he would have been absolutely dirt poor leaving his father and whatever if they still had enough for them to be born into his house when he leaves at what, 75-ish? Yeah.
So maybe you need to rethink Abraham. Here, yes, he's Abram. We just call him Abraham. When President Truman was in World War I, he was a National Guard captain. But we still talk about when President Truman served in World War I. Same thing here. There's no problem with calling Abraham Abraham when we look back. Okay? But he's not the poor, just barely struggling like they make him look in the movies. And I want you to notice something else. All those movies they film over there in the Middle East, prior to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, all of that region of what we commonly call Israel and the Jordan Plain was all thick and lush like the Garden of Eden. So all these movies that show him being, struck by hot wind and sandy and rocky land that they can just barely scrape out enough vegetation for 2 sheep every 10 acres.
Which doesn't sound at all like what Scripture says.
When you start to contemplate how much you've been brainwashed by the media, and that you're taking the programming of Hollywood and Satan and reading it back into the Scripture, and that some of you right now, you're having a problem within yourselves because of what I'm saying to you, understand you don't have a problem with me. You have a problem with the Word, because the devil has programmed you through media to misunderstand what God has said. And if you misunderstand what God said because of the devil programming you, you know what? You're going to miss out on God's goodness and blessing too. And I say that to you as one that I was programmed by Satan too for a long time, till I started sitting down going, no, that's not what it says. And now that's probably my number one phrase. No, that's not what it says. Read what it says. So, other thoughts, my brother?
No, sir.
All right, with that, I'm Brian Reagan. This is
Tyler Kelly.
We bid you